Good evening. My name is Susie Plott, and I am the Community Development and Marketing Manager for Old Mission Santa Barbara. It is my pleasure this evening to welcome you. Not only is today exciting as we have our 5th and final session in the Exploring Race in California speaker series, but today also marks 200 years of the Stone Mission Church that stands today. It was rebuilt and dedicated on September 10th, 1820, after an earthquake destroyed the adobe one that was there before. We have exciting plans for a 200th celebration, which some of you may already have heard about, but if you have not, stay tuned. However, tonight our focus is continuing this important conversation around race. First, a few housekeeping items. A reminder that all attendees are on mute and video screens are turned off. Tonight's session is being recorded and will be added to our website tomorrow. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'll be keeping an eye on it during the presentation, and we'll have time at the end of the presentation for a Q&A. A reminder that this speaker series is being offered free, as we feel like this is an important conversation for us to be a part of. However, please know that we are paying the speakers as we value their work that they put into the presentation and the time that they're taking here to be here tonight with us. So if you would like to support Old Mission Santa Barbara and this speaker series, a donation button is at the bottom of all email communications, including the email that will be sent out afterwards. I do want to clarify this is completely optional, and I do want to thank those that have already contributed and appreciate you just being here tonight this evening. I would now like to introduce Brother Mark, our guardian at Old Mission Santa Barbara, to kick us off and introduce our speaker. Brother Mark.
Thank you, Susie. So this series started when we, the staff of the mission, realized we wanted to respond to the tensions that were happening with numerous deaths of black men by police, and all the ramifications of comments, protests that were nonviolent and violence. And when we realized also then that people were looking at, well, what's the mission? The mission is that involve racism, and as the history of the Spanish and the friars coming to the land of the indigenous folks here in California. So that's how the genesis of this series developed, and we're excited to have Alison with us to wrap it up. So we save the best for last. So, but before I get to give you a little thought for the day, right? And this comes from this coming Sunday's gospel. It's a familiar passage, and I'm just going to read you. It's just 2 lines from that passage, and just listen to the challenge of Jesus, because as Franciscans, friars, and the staff of the parish, those that staff the mission and the parish, those that even ever walk through our doors that capture the spirit of St. Francis St. Clair. One of our goals is about forgiveness. So listen to this, please. This will be the reading throughout the whole world this coming Sunday. It says, then Peter went up to Jesus and said, Lord, how often must I forgive my sister or brother if they wrong me? As often as 7 times? Jesus answered, not 7, but 77 times. Imagine the challenge of people for 2,000 years just to keep forgiving and forgiving. 77, which means you're going to lose count. We in our country need to bring the spirit of forgiveness, especially in what's been going on in the news and in reality, especially with white privilege. So let's take a look through the knowledge and the truth of Alison. Remember, we picked 5 people to give these presentations because I'm going to tell you the truth. So I want to introduce Alison. She's a 3rd-generation Californian. Her name is Alison Rose Jefferson. She's a Dr. Jefferson. She's a historian and heritage conservation consultant. She writes history and does programming around it as a tool in the struggle for social justice. She reconstructs the stories of African American experience which have been left out or marginalized in the telling of our American history. She's currently working on public history projects to recognize and commemorate the historical African American experience during the Jim Crow era in Santa Monica and Los Angeles. Her work has gathered attention at KCET LA programming, in the Los Angeles Times, in the New York Times, the website Ultra Obscura, and in the Los Angeles Magazine, among other media outlets. So Alison, we appreciate your taking time to share with us the truth.
Thank you so, I'm live? Yes. Thank you so much to the Santa Barbara Mission for inviting me to participate in this program tonight. And I'm going to put up the slideshow now. And there we go. So African Americans began moving in large numbers to the Los Angeles environs in the decades surrounding the turn of the 20th century, joining communities of whites and Jews, Chinese, Japanese, Old Californios, and new Mexican immigrants, as well as immigrants of other backgrounds. The majority of the new Black migrants relocated from southern states of the Southern American states. Like those who migrated to the northern part of the US, African Americans moving to California and other Western parts also acted to escape the worst of Jim Crow era anti-Black racial restrictions. African Americans, similar to others who moved, similar to other people who moved to the state, embrace the booster-promoted California dream of a leisure lifestyle in picturesque outdoor settings and new life opportunities, even while discrimination and lax enforcement of California's civil rights laws implemented as early as 1893 for decades into the 20th century prevented them from using various public and private facilities and buying land in many areas. Today, my brief remarks arise out of my new book titled Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. I will explore the book's subject of how African Americans made California and American history by challenging racial and class restrictions when they occupied public space at the core of the state's formative mid-20th century identity. These sites became contested ground in the development of attractive inland resorts and beaches relatively free from white citizens' harassment. In Los Angeles, recreation and relaxation were essential components of liberty and distinctive civil concerns in the nation's long freedom rights struggle. I will also share some ways I, as a historian and others, have used a few of these stories to engage audiences in history, as well as heritage and nature conservation, and in concepts of social and environmental justice. In some places, this has happened more successfully than in others. I offer a view of overlooked and erased extraordinary community builders and socioeconomic development experiences of Black middle-class people of Los Angeles and California, and the impact of leisure that intersects with the new scholarship about the influence of the diverse output of the Harlem Renaissance and the new Negro experience as a cultural movement of national and global phenomena. These stories of unrecognized voices, economic development initiative, and civil rights struggle add new information and understanding about how African Americans sought to seize their California and American dreams, to appropriate and to shape the offerings of their new environment in the far West. These stories I recaptured, recast the significance, meaning, and place of leisure by recognizing African American leadership and action, therefore giving a more complex understanding of the American experience in the West and California, where racial discrimination existed in practice rather than legally, as in many other states in the nation in the post-enslavement and modern capitalist era. In contrast to the city where African Americans lived, California waterfront and pastoral places where they went to relax and invest in real estate included Bruce's Beach down in Manhattan Beach. There we go. And also Santa Monica's Bay Street Beach, which has sometimes controversially been called the Inkwell, and Eureka Villa, later known as Valverde, up in Santa Clarita Valley. All of these were in Los Angeles County. And then Lake Elsinore and Corona's Park Ridge Country Club in Riverside. And then I talk about a few other places as well. The stories of California's largest and most popular, though not broadly remembered, African American leisure destinations were sites of pleasure, identity, challenge to racist anti-Black public policies and private actions, and economic development that flourished for different times, for different time durations between the 1900s to the 1960s. These are the stories of public and private memories of African Americans of all socioeconomic classes, the new Negro, who migrated out of the US South to the northern, Midwestern, and far Western cities in the post-World War I decades to escape racial injustice. These migrants, including soldiers arriving home from Europe after the Great War, who were more self-confident and sometimes militant, demanded their rights as citizens and consumers. The consumption of leisure as a particular lifestyle and a performance vehicle of various social practices to gain fulfillment, self-determination, and uplift became a new forceful marker in the claim of middle-class status, place, and American citizenship and culture that spread from California to the rest of the United States beginning early in the 20th century. Race, power, privilege, and wealth often influenced leisure's opportunities, just as it determined who was able to take advantage of economic and social opportunities in California. Even with these impacts, African American leisure builders and seekers, through creative assertion, claimed and performed full humanity, civic membership, social and economic development, resourcefulness, and self-determination. This history is layered with stories about group and individual circumstances and chronicles about migration patterns, socioeconomic status, cultural practices, and education and employment opportunities, and social power. These multifaceted, intersecting, and overlapping experiences and stories took place in private and public spaces. They are inseparable from one another in their composition and reflection of the structural racial exclusion and class exploitation imposed on African Americans and other people of color. Just as the leisure and resort spaces in other parts of the US were developed by African Americans during the Jim Crow era, in Southern California, African American leisure spaces developed to promote the interests of the race and advance a complex mix of political perspectives supporting freedom, economic development, and emotional and physical rejuvenation. Unwilling to accept exclusion, Black Angelenos, like their counterparts in other places, developed separate leisure spaces against oppressive racial subjugation of the era and to promote a renewed sense of racial pride, cultural self-expression, economic independence, and progressive politics that were the embodiment of the new Negro determined to achieve a fuller participation in American society. The experiences and memories of these leisure spaces and destinations and the attention they gained in public memory and newspapers of the era offered African Americans new and broader visions of themselves, a new identity, and a new collective sense of freedom, contributing to cultural and intellectual efforts that defined the new Negro. In California, African Americans' ambitions and initiatives for leisure space also radically claimed, challenged, and promoted the state's identity in the consumption of leisure as a lifestyle that would spread across the country to develop a new suburban middle-class culture. Black Angelenos challenged the era's white supremacist conventions about social spaces as they asserted self-determination to participate in popular leisure and resort, cultural, social, and economic trends that were considered modern by the 1920s. In ex-urban communities, African Americans bought property so they could control their enjoyment of these activities and contest white racism. Particularly, they were challenging whites' prejudice and power in the labeling of African Americans as laborers and as inferior. Common and divergent patterns of many African American leisure retreats in California and across the US are important to reconstruct and preserve for the memory and heritage of these sites and proper understanding of them as places of commerce, of social networks, community, of identity, contestation, and civil rights. Each site has its own history of the development of leisure of a specific sort in social, political, and economic particulars, as well as racialized issues of time and of the time and place. One of the earliest places African Americans went for recreation and relaxation was Lake Elsinore in Riverside County, a somewhat successful residential and leisure destination for the general public and African Americans through the middle decades of the 20th century. This was one of the furthest inland of the African American leisure spaces that existed from the 1910s to the 1960s. The vagaries of the lake condition and changing leisure tastes and race relations dynamics over the years impacted African American entrepreneurs, resort business opportunities, and success. The African American presence has been left out of the local history narratives and landmark designation programming. This omission of the African American experience obstructs our understanding of the full shared collective history of the range of community builders and their impact and contributions to the development of Lake Elsinore and the Southern California region. The Park Ridge Country Club in Corona in Riverside, California, in Riverside County, was a private elite club and leisure space developed originally for a white-only clientele. A group of very ambitious African-American businessmen, Journey White, physician Eugene C. Nelson, and entrepreneur Clarence R. Bailey, purchased the site to operate as an interracial space and attempted an attempt at Black community suburbanization and elite recreation in 1927. The local elite and other white racist citizens strongly contested the African American reconstruction of this venue in the Corona community. The African American businessmen's efforts to make the venture a success have been left out of the local history narrative, and there have been no local attempts of revival of the history or incorporation of it into the public record of the local community, thereby limiting our understanding, again, of a local community's historical actors and evolution, in this case, Corona. Eureka Villa, later known as Valverde, in the Santa Clarita area of Los Angeles County, was initially an African-American planned resort community. It was a planned resort community project with Euro-American partners that began in 1924. An early leader of this project was Black Angelino and real estate impresario and booster Sidney P. Jones. Public money contributed to the development of a park and swimming pool, and multiple efforts by boosters, both Black and white, helped sustain interest of African American consumers' usage of this Hidden Canyon area until the crumbling of the racial apartheid era in the 1960s. By 2015, the Valverde community had been recast as one of the last rural areas remaining with affordable housing in the Santa Clarita Valley, with limited public memory of the African American heritage. Bruce's Beach in Manhattan Beach, a Pacific Rim community in southwestern Los Angeles County, was an early successful African American residential and leisure destination which opened in 1912. Eventually, racial exclusionary measures, aided by destructive use of state power in 1925, eliminated their residential and economic development, with attempts to erase the site's memory from history. They said a park needed to be developed. So with all of this, only through political assertion has a limited revival of the history of Bruce's Beach and its incorporation into the public record emerged in the first decades of the 21st century. The Bruce's Beach community and its visitors were not alone in facing legal sanctions and private harassment actions discouraging African Americans from visiting and settling in particular beach locales as the region's population increased during the 1920s. During this decade, several Save the Beach campaigns were implemented to keep African Americans from creating or maintaining beach resorts. Similarly, similar cases to exclude African Americans occurred at other Southern California beach towns in the 1920s. You'll have to read my book to learn more about those. There were confrontations and assaults across decades, and some of these assaults turned violent, and they were aimed to bar African Americans from public beaches, which was the most coveted recreation and relaxation destination then as it is now. Activists mounted legal challenges to these discriminatory practices endeavored by whites. In their first organized civil disobedience action in the region, members of the Los Angeles branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1927 challenged Manhattan Beach officials when they tried additional measures to make the beach white only. Although the Bruce's Beach community was raised when NAACP members staged a swim-in protest, after being arrested and fined and legal maneuvers, clarification was won that African Americans had the legal right to enjoy this and all California beaches. And this was also an important act that helped everyone in California as it relates to beach access issues. And we realize today that there are still some issues with those things. In the coming decades, with this accomplishment, African Americans' more confident assertion of their legal rights contributed to racial restriction attempts by whites at state public beaches fading away. The Afro-Angelinos were energized by this victory. At this time, the NAACP National Office proclaimed in a press release this militant stance for civil rights in Southern California set a good backdrop for their 19th convention that would be held in Los Angeles in 1928. As the 20th century advanced, African Americans around the US would increasingly utilize legal sanctions and public protests to dismantle legally sanctioned along with informally enforced discrimination and segregation in public accommodations. After various waves of local citizens, sometimes contentious public discussion about their municipality's heritage over many years, in 2007, the site not officially known as Bruce's Beach was formally commemorated by Manhattan Beach city leaders with a Pacific Oceanfront Park named in its honor and a descriptive text, a plaque with a descriptive text that has gross inaccuracies, and all of this happened 80 years after the Black resort community was removed. The public commemoration opened up broader claims for not just public memory, but also African American identity, even with the signage text that dilutes, misrepresents, and partially omits the site's historical truths and understanding. Fast forward to 2020, a new energy has arisen to reclaim the important marginalized California ocean coastal history of African American places of enjoyment, freedom struggle, and community and economic development sabotaged during the Jim Crow era. Bruce's Beach, as I mentioned, in Manhattan Beach, and also the Bay Street Beach in Santa Monica, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, have been sites of consciousness and reflection, sites of conscience and reflection for memorial and celebratory events at this time in 2020, when systematic racial inequalities have been laid bare by the long history of injustice that has led to the death of several African Americans and other people of color. These events were held at these sites to show solidarity with the nationwide protests against systematic anti-Black racism and police brutality, which the Black Lives Matter movement has forced prominently onto the national agenda as part of the reclamation of and commitment to the Black freedom struggle. This year, Bruce's Beach has been the event site of a memorial for Breonna Taylor, the young woman who was an emergency medical technician in Kentucky that was shot dead in her home by police officers executing a warrant at the wrong place in March. It has been a celebration space of Father's Day and Juneteenth, which is the day, it's June 19th, and it's the day that African Americans in Galveston, Texas, learned that the Civil War had ended 2 years after Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. More than 100 people with the new Black History Makers group showed up with balloons and cupcakes and flowers and signs to commemorate Breonna Taylor's birthday in June. Another group, the newly formed Anti-Racist Moms around the South Bay, organized its inaugural event, a Juneteenth picnic. The Moms' mission is to create a safe space for Black people and other people of color, and allies to discuss and find solutions to end the cycle of racism, starting with their children. They want to create awareness of the history and the injustice done to Manhattan Beach's pioneering African American families, to promote change in the hearts and minds of all to move forward towards a fairer and more socially just society. Members have proposed getting the history of Bruce's Beach in the local school lessons. In 2017, I did a presentation on the history at 2 different Manhattan Beach schools and worked with a local resident to do just this, get the history of Bruce's Beach into lessons of the local schools. We were not successful with this first attempt at that time, but with the current social movement pressures, I am hopeful this education initiative will gain meaningful traction to be implemented in the Manhattan Beach and other regional schools. Joining the current national movement against joining the current national movement around social justice initiatives to address anti-Black racism, Manhattan Beach city officials announced on August 18th, that about a month ago, that they will set up a task force to devise a plan and a timetable to accurately revise and illuminate the Bruce's Beach history on the park signage and develop other related public education programming. As I mentioned, in Santa Monica, there were also some of these events at the Bay Street Beach, using that area for a paddle out, and they did a memorial for George Floyd, the man who was killed during an arrest by white police officers who knelt on his neck for almost 8 minutes in Minnesota in May. And also they did an event for Breonna Taylor. These Santa Monica events, as I mentioned, were held at a place, were held at the Bay Street Beach, and it's a place near where African Americans were able to build a sustained community in the Bay City. That was this community, the community of Santa Monica, was founded in the 1880s. The African American community there is a few blocks from the Pacific shoreline in the environs of what is today the southern area of the Civic Center and around Phillips Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, the first African American church established in Santa Monica. A short way south from this area in Venice, there was also a neighborhood there which was part of the Santa Monica African American community. In the years surrounding Phillips Chapel's beginnings in 1908 at 4th and Bay Streets, the oceanfront area down the hill around Pico, south a few blocks to Bicknell Avenue, emerged as a gathering place where African Americans from all over Los Angeles County and beyond came to enjoy the beach's pleasures. While the boundaries shifted through time, it was a popular beach destination for African Americans from 1900 to the 1960s. Many of the beachgoers once referred to this stretch of coastline as the Bay Street Beach. Others sometimes called it the Inkwell. The latter name was most certainly derogatory and first used by whites, referring to the skin color of the beachgoers. Some African Americans reclaim the name and use it as a badge of pride. Some who went to this beach never used this name for the place. And in contemporary times, there are people who still would prefer the name not be used. African American regional residents and Los Angeles entrepreneurs attempting leisure space, service business expansion for their community were challenged by various white supremacist policy measures inhibiting residential expansion and economic development. Nonetheless, African American citizens' public beach usage and small local residential community was able to persist despite Santa Monica's white elite racist anti-Black actions. The local African American community's persistence has mattered in the reclamation of place and memory in the 21st century heritage conservation efforts and public history programming that has been initiated by citizens groups and public officials. This and other Southern California leisure spaces mark an African American identity on the regional landscape and social space as they confronted the emergent power politics of leisure space and set the stage for these sites as places for remembrance of invention and public contest. The city of Santa Monica's 2005 landmark designation of Phillips Chapel CME Church set the stage in 2008 for official recognition with a cultural monument of the historical African American beach gathering place at Bay Street and the oceanfront. Also recognized was Nick Gabaldon, the first documented surfer of African American and Mexican American descent in the Santa Monica Bay. Gabaldon and other African Americans' actions to use this and other beaches embody the local stories that contribute to the national narrative of mass movement to open leisure space to all, demonstrating how the struggle for leisure and public space, along with political and economic issues, reshaped the long freedom rights struggle. As a public historian, I have led coordination to facilitate remembrance of African American voices at Santa Monica's historic sites through the development of innovative public programming partnerships between the Santa Monica Conservancy, Heal the Bay, the Black Surfers Collective, Surf Academy, Los Angeles County Supervisors, the California Historical Society, and other groups. The benefit of an ongoing investment in pluralistic heritage and nature education through these partnerships is important to continue building further, to continue building future pathways to new, wider, and younger audiences, as well as established audiences in support of heritage and nature conservation ideals. This programming, such as Nick Gabaldon Day, International Coastal Cleanup Day, and field trips for youngsters from South Los Angeles, actively connects diverse publics to more complex, culturally inclusive stories of our collective national history, beach wildlife and stewardship, environmental justice concepts such as beach access, civic action, and public policy through various activities. And beach recreation is part of this, including an introductory surfing lesson on one field trip that's also part of the experiences. Supporting the California Coastal Commission in early 2019, I made a presentation to back their efforts to enact social and environment, I helped them to justify or to help them to celebrate their enactment of their social and environmental justice policy with a presentation that I did. This new policy includes recognition of the history and current conditions of it includes recognition of the history and current conditions of disenfranchised communities to create a policy that is an important new operational step towards a more fully realized vision of coastal protection and access for all people to enjoy the state's coastline. As part of the California Coastal Commission's policy mandate, the city of Santa Monica was asked to develop an education program to teach the public about the history of the African Americans who lived and worked in the Ocean Park district in the coastal zone prior to waves of urban renewal projects that displaced their community in that area before 1960 as part of the historic Belmar Park sports field construction plan. An outdoor exhibition of historical text panels, a large sculpture grade school lesson plans, and other education and information programming, including a website, will bring this area's history to life for present and future generations. The public commemoration of the Santa Monica Bay Historical African American Coastal Zone sites I have discussed today, and other similar sites throughout California and the nation, opens the door towards social and environmental justice by recognizing that communities of color have a right to historical and cultural sites, along with clean air and water and enjoyment of America's natural and other resources. Like many white Americans, Black Americans were lured to California for its opportunities and the good life imagery produced by writers, painters, photographers, and movie makers, which were used by various boosters promoting migration to the state. The stories and imagery of African Americans who participated in various phases of the Western migration and settlement continue to remain largely absent from the dominant mythologies and history surrounding the Western migration, notwithstanding investigations of the Black West published during the last 50 years. Today, I've briefly highlighted little-known stories about African American agency and socioeconomic investment in the California Dream lifestyle at what have been called frontier of leisure destinations in Southern California from the 1900s to the 1960s. As well, the intersection of the stories in my book and the public process activities I've discussed for education, remembrance of our collective history, cultural identity, and stewardship action offer new ways to connect people with natural, cultural, and historical heritage, and encourage visitation to these locations and others around the U.S. As a historian, I have and I will continue to firmly engage in encouraging people to use history for these broader education programs, for wider equity and access for all people, for enjoyment of the California coastline, and other American cultural and natural places now and in the future. So I hope you'll take time to learn about these forgotten Western pioneers and their undertakings, and ponder the implications of their stories for our lives today. And I hope you will pick up my book too. Thank you very much for having me speak with you all today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was great. If you want to stop sharing and then they can see us. Oh, here, I can maybe do it. Okay, so we do have a few questions for you. Let's see. So the first question is, sorry if you said this and I missed it, but who was Bruce of Bruce's Beach, and what happened in 1925 that disposed of the owners? And I'd love to hear more about that as well.
So I didn't go into detail of who the Bruces were, but I did say that there was state action that occurred to close down the place. What happened was the Bruces were a couple. It was Willa and Charles Bruce. They started the resort in 1912, and they had resort facilities. And then a residential community grew up around there where African Americans had purchased property and built and built places there. And so in 24, there were eminent domain actions that were taken by local officials because they decided they didn't want Black people to be there and have this resort. And so when they took the land, the African Americans did protest it, and they were not able to retain the land, and eventually they were paid off. Now, whether they were paid off appropriately in terms of what the future value of the land is and what their usage of it was is a whole nother story. But it made the community what it is today, which is mostly a white community. And you can pick up my book and you can learn a little more about all those details. I couldn't, you know, talk about everything in this short talk today.
No, that totally makes sense. And it is an interesting story. I read an article, I think that the LA Times put out about it that you're quoted in, talking about Bruce's Beach, which is very interesting. So we have another question here that says, are you able to speak to the recent tensions in Orange County and other beaches during the pandemic closures when people from the inland areas, mainly some people of color, were facing locals trying to close the beaches and to non-locals, and it was causing some tensions?
Well, I mean, the issue is that people get territorial about their beaches, and people of color are just more readily recognizable as being different from white people who have white privilege and power to try to keep people off the beach. I don't know what else I could say about that other than that. At this point in time, it's a racist action, and it's unfortunate, but you know, we're in a time of stress, and when you're in a time of stress, that's when in the latter 20th century, or not the latter, but in the 20th century, that's been a time when a lot of racist actions arise. And one of the earlier speakers was talking about even in the 19th century, when the Chinese finished the railroad, and they decided they didn't want the Chinese to continue to be here because they were moving into other areas, and the whites were feeling like they were having too much success, and so they started they implemented the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s. So it's not something that's uncommon. It's just unfortunate.
Yeah, no, I agree. So here's a question that says, engaging presentation, so thank you. Although I was familiar with Inkwell and Bruce's Beach, I did not know about Park Ridge and Corona. A few years back, I read Bound for Freedom by Douglas Fleming, and it barely touched on Bruce's Beach. Thank you for sharing in this presentation. I'm currently living in Manhattan Beach area, and I'm very familiar with the eminent domain processings for the purpose of the park, but left it vacant for many years. I look forward to reading your book. Thank you. So, there's also a comment in here, which is less directed to you, but just the greater audience who's watching the presentation, just around exploring more around a speaker who can talk to the Santa Barbara Ventura area Black history and by a local expert. Dr. Jefferson, we previously had a speaker, James Yee, who spoke about the Barbaño Chumash experience here locally. And so I appreciate that.
Well, there is a historic African-American community that's in Santa Barbara, and there's also one that's in Ventura. And you all there recently in Santa Barbara commemorated the historic church, the first AME church that's at Haley and, I forget the cross street, but anyway, it's a beautiful little church. And so that the African-American community there at the early part of the century was small. And they, at different times in terms of Haley, had businesses that also supported tourism for African Americans. There were a few restaurants, and there was, you know, a little inn. It was more like a B&B. You know, somebody had you know, an extra bedroom and they, you know, you could stay there. It was more like a B&B. And then also in terms of mid 20th century, the trash company there, Marlboro,
Yeah.
it was started by an African American man, and part of his family lived in Pasadena, and the family still owns some land in the Santa Barbara area, but he was the one that started that trash hauling business, and then he sold it.
Wow, interesting. I love the suggestion on the topic. One of the things that I meant to mention in my intro is that we have added a survey to the screen, which I'll send out after this, because this is not a one and done conversation. This is something that I've already talked to Dr. Jefferson about. You know, this is the first step in exploring a greater conversation around race. And so we want to continue having these conversations. So I appreciate the suggestion, and maybe I'll chat with you about somebody that we could talk to, you know, in more detail locally about the history here. There's a few other comments just thanking you. There's somebody says that I can't wait to buy your book. I need more information. And there's another person just saying thank you, and thank you for the extra information about Santa Barbara. So we'll wait about a few more seconds if there's any other final questions. Otherwise, I really do want to thank you, Dr. Jefferson, for being here with us this evening and taking the time to share the knowledge with us. And we will, you know, continue exploring. So thank you.
Yes, thank you all very much. Thanks to the audience.
Yes. And so we will, like I said, I'll send out a survey with the follow-up email. So if you have any suggestions for future topics for us to continue to explore, we would love to hear them from you. So have a great